The morning sun bathed Ouagadougou in soft shades of gold as President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of the presidential palace. But unlike his usual mornings filled with official briefings and diplomatic meetings, today carried a different, heavier energy, a decision that would shock his security team and ripple through the heart of the nation. With a calm yet determined voice, he instructed his driver, "Drive me to the central prison," adjusting the collar of his simple brown shirt, intentionally leaving behind the symbols of power. No press, no advance notice, just us. The driver's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his eyes wide in the rearview mirror, hesitating. "Sir, shouldn't we inform the prison authorities, arrange for security?" Traoré's response was firm and unwavering. "No. I want to witness the real conditions, not some polished show." The black presidential SUV, followed by just two unmarked vehicles, moved quietly through the buzzing streets of the capital where vendors hawked their goods, children laughed in dusty courtyards, and life carried on unaware that their president was embarking on a mission that would expose the cracks in their justice system. After 40 minutes, the convoy rolled to a stop before the towering gray walls of Ouagadougou's central prison, lined with menacing razor wire that shimmered under the sun, the air heavy with the weight of untold stories. Guards at the entrance froze in disbelief as they recognized the vehicle, one stumbling with the keys, stammering, Mr. President, we weren't expecting you." But before he could finish, Traoré stepped out with authority, replying, "That's exactly why I'm here. Open the gates." The prison warden, Pascal Wedrao, came running, beads of sweat on his brow despite the cool morning, panicked. "Your Excellency! If we'd known, we would have prepared. The cells, the prisoners." But the president cut him off sharply. "I'm not here for preparations. Take me to them." With no choice but to comply, the warden led Traoré through narrow corridors echoing with the clang of metal doors, coughing and muffled conversations, the suffocating smell of unwashed bodies, damp concrete, and despair hitting them like a wall. As they entered the main prison block, an eerie silence swept the area. Moments ago, men lay on thin mattresses, played cards, or stared blankly at peeling walls. But now they stood slowly, confusion and disbelief written across their faces, followed by something rare, flickers of hope. Traoré moved among them without distance or formality, shaking hands, looking into their eyes, asking with genuine care, "How long have you been here?" A gaunt middle-aged man replied, "3 years, Mr. President, for theft." "Family?" Traoré asked. "A wife and 2 kids, sir. They visit when they can afford the transport." The president nodded, absorbing every word with a solemn expression, moving on from face to face, collecting stories of injustice, pain, and resilience. Some prisoners spoke boldly, others guarded, and a few simply broke down in tears, overwhelmed not by punishment, but by the sheer shock that the leader of their country was standing among them, listening. For over an hour, Traoré sat on cold concrete floors, entered cramped cells, and connected with men society had long chosen to forget. But it was a small, dimly lit cell at the far end of the block that drew his attention, a figure who hadn't stirred when the others stood. The man sat motionless in the corner, head bowed, hands resting weakly in his lap, his beard overgrown, clothes worn thin, his entire body radiating not defiance, but surrender, as though life had already broken him beyond repair. Unlike the others whose curiosity or desperation had pulled them toward the presence of the president, this man didn't even lift his gaze until the silence itself demanded it. Slowly, almost unwillingly, his eyes rose to meet Traoré, and in that instant, the president felt something shift, a gaze filled with more than sadness, more than defeat. It carried a hollow depth, an ache that seemed heavier than the prison walls themselves. There was something different about this prisoner. Not the man sitting in the dim corner of that prison cell didn't carry the hardened gaze of a career criminal, but rather the shattered spirit of someone whom life had crushed beyond recognition. And as President Traoré knelt down slightly, lowering his voice, he asked gently, "What is your name?" The reply came faint, barely a whisper, "Emmanuel," a name heavy with silent suffering. "How long have you been here, Emmanuel?" the president continued, and the answer struck like a hammer. "7 years, sir." Those 2 words hung in the air, suffocating, heavier than the concrete walls surrounding them. Traoré studied Emmanuel's face, searching for bitterness, rage, or resentment, yet what he found stunned him. There was none of it, only the quiet, wounded dignity of a man who had been stripped of everything yet somehow refused to let hatred consume him. "What were you accused of?" the president pressed softly, and Emmanuel swallowed hard before responding. "They said I stole money from my employer, but I didn't, sir. I worked for that man for years. He needed someone to blame, and I was convenient." As the words left his mouth, something awakened within him, a spark of strength long buried under the suffocating weight of injustice, as if finally being heard was breathing life back into him. Traoré leaned in, reading between every pause, every tremble, trained to sense the truth beneath the surface. Emmanuel's story unfolded like a wound being reopened, raw and painful yet necessary. I had no lawyer, Emmanuel continued, his voice now growing steadier, no one to speak for me. When they brought me to court, I stood alone. While my former boss sat comfortably beside his expensive attorneys, the judge barely glanced at me before declaring 15 years. Something tightened in the president's chest, cold and sharp, a fury that only grew as Emmanuel added. His name was Laurent Gur. He owned a logistics company. I worked as a clerk for 8 years, never missed a day, always honest. But then, his nephew needed a job. Emmanuel's voice trailed into silence, the ache of betrayal fresh as if it had happened yesterday. Traoré spun sharply toward the prison warden, who had been hovering nervously in the background, and his tone left no room for negotiation. Bring me this man's file, every document, every record, every scrap of evidence, and I want it before sunset. The warden stammered, Sir, that might take, but the president's voice cut through like steel, no excuses. I also want the names of the arresting officers, the presiding judge, and everyone involved in the investigation. As the warden scurried away, the president turned back to Emmanuel. Why didn't you appeal? Surely, there were options. A hollow laugh escaped Emmanuel's lips, not of humor, but of a man long abandoned by fairness. With what money, sir? My wife left me within the first year. She took our children, moved back to her family's village, said she couldn't bear the shame. I had no money, no connections, no voice that anyone cared to hear. Each word landed like a hammer on the president's conscience, the picture of an entire system's failure growing clearer by the second. And, in all these years, any visitors? That evening,